Hello, Blogging Heads Nation. This is the latest recording of Drezburt. I'm Daniel Drezner. I'm a professor of international politics at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and I write the Spoiler Alerts blog for Washington Post.
I'm Heather Hurlburt, Senior Fellow for National Security at Human Rights First. And we actually start today with, Dan, we do need to take a moment and toot our own horns, which is to say that we called 3 out of the 4 semifinalists in the World Cup, and we came damn close to crowning the champion.
That is true. Although I have to say, watching the final, you kind of thought that Germany was. It was a good competitive game, but I was reasonably confident by the end that Germany was going to win. But yes, I am feeling good about that. I'm also, might add, feeling good about Team USA as a result of this, because we also only lost to Germany 1-0, as opposed to other countries that hosted the World Cup and did not do as well.
We had a brutal moment in sports education yesterday in my household where we went to a Nationals game, and the pitcher, Gio Gonzalez, the starter, had a bad day, had to come out early. Replacement came in and pitched 3 really standout 9 up, 9 down, I believe, or close to it innings. My son waited eagerly for the end of the game for him to be named MVP, but the Nats fell behind, and there had to be a clutch game-winning hit in the bottom of the 9th. And my son was devastated that the pitcher got robbed. And I heard myself saying that immortal phrase, so useful in international relations: life isn't fair.
Wow. Also useful from The Princess Bride. Anyone, that's what you learn about international relations. It certainly has not been a boring week for that topic. But before we talk about the big stuff, you want to talk about the stuff that the big stuff might have crowded out, correct?
Well, this was a week in which there was so much international news that news about negotiations around Iran's nuclear program did not make the front page. Mm-hmm. So you may have missed, and this is a really interesting development, that the talks have been carried over the deadline was Sunday, and they've been carried over for an additional 4 months, which the official reason for that is that it goes to exactly the day a year ago that the agreement was signed between the U.S. and Iran. It also, if you quickly count to 4 on your fingers, happens to fall shortly after the U.S. midterm elections, thus taking any agreement out of things people can fight about over the next 4 months.
True. Let me ask you, so, I would say 2 things about this. The first is that in some ways the very fact that this was announced, in the traditional Friday news dump period suggests that the United States was not necessarily wanting to trumpet this fact. And that said, having read some of the commentary on it, I have to say I think I've grown more pessimistic about the likelihood of a deal actually being negotiated. I'm curious what do you think this is a positive development, or is this literally a kicking the can down the road kind of development?
Well, it's clear that the 2 issues they're stuck on are 2 big issues that they've been stuck on from the beginning. One being how much of its enrichment capacity Iran is actually going to destroy as opposed to just mothball, and the other being how much sanctions relief is Iran going to get and when is it going to get it. So, that does give one pause, or it puts a dent in one's optimism. On the other hand, I'll rattle off a couple reasons to be optimistic. One being that Iran actually has been freezing and downgrading its capacity over the last over the last months since the agreement went into effect.
Since the interim deal, right?
Yeah, okay, that is 7 months actually. I can do math. And frankly, the other reason I think for optimism, at least right now, is that the concern with Iran's nuclear weapons is now the second most important issue for everybody concerned, including the Iranians. And this is where this issue kind of links into other current events. Israel right now cannot argue that Iran is the most important existential threat it faces. Iran, faced with the rise of ISIS and the threat to its interests in Iraq and Syria, as well, frankly, as the extent to which Iran is tied down supporting various groups in Gaza, even Iran has to take its eye off the nuclear ball a little bit here, and thus potentially creating more room for everybody to maneuver. And as we'll discuss, there are a jillion other things going on for the U.S. So to me, that's a positive in the near to midterm. I think the thing I'm most pessimistic about is that regional dynamics, frankly, are going to make it harder and harder for everyone to back down when you have when you have increasing violence, factionalism, and a heightened sense of threat among everyone in the region. It's just going to get harder and harder for anybody to say, hey, this is a really great time to do a deal with our archenemy X. And that actually, because that then reinforces the bad political dynamics that you have in Tehran, in Washington, in other capitals. So that's my sort of reason for midterm concern. But, I can balance that also by saying this was handled very carefully. Nobody wanted the talks to collapse. At the end, Zarif, the foreign minister, came back with a counteroffer that was considerably less negative than what had been coming out of Tehran before that. So,
right.
This is, frankly, given the depths of negativity we have elsewhere in the region, this is still a bright spot.
There is that weird thing when you look at this, which is to say, again, compared to everything else in the region, this is actually, this is the least bad development, or potentially a positive development. I think the thing I've grown more pessimistic about over time is whether or not, let's assume for the moment that an agreement could actually be reached, and I'm not sure that it can. Again, mostly because I'm not sure how much flexibility Zarif and Rouhani have to cut a deal without Khamenei's blessing. It's whether or not there's actually a win set, for to use the IR term, because the extent to which the U.S. Congress is going to constrain Obama on this, and the extent to which Khamenei is going to constrain the Iranian negotiators on this, it's not obvious to me yet, or in some ways it's become less obvious to me than it would have been a year ago, that there actually is a deal that both sides could live with, I guess would be the way to put it. And that's the one thing that sort of gives me pause and makes me wonder where we actually will be at the end of November on this.
Yeah. One thing you said I agree with. Well, on the Iranian side, I think they have no room to cut a deal without Khamenei's agreement.
Right, exactly.
None. So, any deal gets his imprimatur, it doesn't happen. And I think what we have no way of knowing, in which it's not at all clear to me that he actually knows, is, are they really ready to do it in the final analysis? And that, black box. We have, I'm not as pessimistic as I would have been 6 months ago, about Congress. And I don't want to. I will
defer to your expertise on this, so I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Well, you had a very strong effort to really undercut the talks early this year, and it failed. And it failed in two very interesting ways. One was a number of Democrats walked right up to the brink of sabotaging their own president and then decided they didn't want to do that and turned around and walked back. Second, when push came to shove, are you going to undercut the diplomacy of a sitting president? AIPAC, which was reflecting the very strong concerns the government of Israel has about it, and its Republican allies parted company. And there was a decision by the Israeli government and by AIPAC, although each acting separately for their own reasons, that they had pushed as hard as it was useful to go, and that it would not be in their interest to force a vote and try to impose sanctions going against a sitting president. Not everybody thought that was going to be what happened. And that having happened once, I think it will make it easier for it to happen again. Now, I do think there's an important question now. I think if they had gotten a deal this weekend, it would have been pretty easy. Well, easy is the wrong word. If they had gotten a deal this weekend, I think it would have been possible to say, right now, Israel is depending a lot on the U.S. as it continues its operation in Gaza. This isn't the moment to mount an all-out campaign to kill a priority of an American president. I don't think we know, I certainly don't know, how the situation in Israel and Gaza plays out in the next weeks, how that's going to affect the way that Israel makes its case here and the way that the traditionally pro-Israeli groups here make their case around Iran. I could see a number of different ways that could cut, and it's too early to know.
I guess these are interesting points. The only thing I would push back on is the following, which is it is easier for the administration to be able to stop punitive action towards Iran, preventing this from coming up to a vote. That's one thing. But in some ways, some of the sanctions relief that Iran will seek will actually require congressional approval. And that's the part where I start to get a little more skeptical. You're right. I don't think the Democrats, even if the Democrats, in the end decide they don't want to undercut the sitting president, it seems perfectly plausible to me that the Republicans might decide that they would want to do that. The one thing, as you say, the timing, if there winds up being a comprehensive deal and it's done at the end of November, the fact that it would be a lame duck Congress that would potentially be able to pass whatever we're talking about makes it, I think, mildly more plausible. But I wish I could share your optimism. I don't know if I can. And I think the other thing that concerns me is the extent to which, although here we honestly don't know, is the extent to which how many in the Iranians actually have any awareness whatsoever of U.S. domestic politics, and that feeds into their own pessimism about the likelihood of a deal.
Yeah. I mean, that's been the great concern all the way along. Just one sort of small correction. More of the sanctions than you would think have some kind of waiver attached to them.
Okay.
So, yes, there will need to be legislative action, but one of the reasons that there needs to be legislative action is that the Iranians do have enough understanding of American politics to say, hey, we don't want this hanging over our head. And of course, that is exactly what the U.S. wants.
Yeah.
So, the immediate concern, frankly, and especially if, as your last comment implied, that the Senate changes hands, is that you could affirmatively have legislation passed that would actually make sanctions relief harder.
Right.
So, it's possible to do some significant stuff without Congress. Eventually, you do need Congress. And the administration, by the way, has gone to Congress and said, we understand that we need you and we're not going to try to do this without you. So, pessimism, optimism. But look, again, are you torturing a small animal?
No, I swear to God, that's a truck behind me, but I did have to turn around to see what the hell that was.
But I mean, again, the thing we should note is that as opposed to much else that is going on in the region, the problem is not getting worse. Iran is not enriching at a high level. And, it is, I mean, and maybe this is as good a moment as any to shift to the discussion of the late lamented Israeli-Palestinian peace process. But
I was going to say, speaking of pessimism, Heather.
But in point of fact, look, I mean, this interim deal is accomplishing the thing that everyone was most worried about.
Yeah. No. I think it's, Julia Ioffe had a great bit on This Week, and she wrote this up in the New Republic, where she was sort of pushing back against the sort of overarching sense of, oh my God, the world's never been more turbulent. The world's never been more turbulent, by saying, come on, give me a break. We always think things are never going to get worse. And there's a tendency, given what else is playing out in the news, to believe everything is falling apart. And I think you're right to say that the negotiations are not falling apart. And in that sense, it's worth pointing that out. Now, all that said, speaking of pessimism, Heather, there was a big, 10,000 word story that the New Republic posted last night that in some ways was the very, very long obituary for John Kerry's effort to negotiate a peace deal between Benjamin Netanyahu and Mahmoud Abbas that sort of eventually ended in failure. I think late April was when the final sort of nail in the coffin was, I believe, hammered in, if memory serves. Is that correct, Heather?
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, so, there are a number of interesting revelations that come from this story. I would say that the three that stand out for me is, first, the extent to which, let me put it this way, have more empathy for Benjamin Netanyahu now than I think I ever had in his political career after reading that piece. Because you realize now that Netanyahu does not represent the sort of hawkish far right wing of Israeli politics anymore. That, weirdly enough, Netanyahu is now probably closer to the moderates than he is to the base of his own party.
Now, I'm going to stop you right there and invite you to clarify, because there's two different ways you could interpret that. And one interpretation is Israeli politics have moved that far right during Netanyahu's career. The other is this argument that I think was maybe more believed a year ago than now, and I may even have advanced it a year ago, that Netanyahu himself had moderated. So which are you saying it is?
I think it's mostly the former and a little bit of the latter. It's mostly the former in the sense of, now he has to deal with people like Naftali Bennett and so forth that are attacking him on the right. And that represents the shift rightward of Israeli politics. But also partially it did represent, at least in the course of the article, the sense that Netanyahu really did think that a deal was possible in a way that he might not have at the outset of the negotiations. There's a telling little anecdote where at one point Netanyahu basically has to sort of, gets into a pissing match with Naftali Bennett and tells Bennett, you better apologize for something you just said, otherwise we're kicking you out of the coalition and we will go to Labor, which would have meant an obviously much more moderate coalition. And Bennett in the end, backs down because he realizes the threat is credible. And before that incident, someone asked Netanyahu what he thought the odds of a peace deal being done, and he said 40-60. After that, they asked him again, and he said 60-40 this time. So he really did seem like he was, at least taking the process somewhat seriously, in a way that I, based on what I'd read of him before, would not have necessarily guessed.
So can I stop you again? And I should now confess to the Blogging Heads public that I have only gotten partway through this article. You saw my eyes wandering off the screen a minute ago, and I was frantically trying to get in a few more paragraphs while Drezner was making his introduction. It has been remarked in the last week that Netanyahu's comments about what the future of Israeli security looks like suggests that he does not believe that
in the two-state solution.
And that makes me wonder. I mean, he has been a master for years at saying things and having different communities interpret them different ways.
Right.
And it does also the timing of the appearance of an article that reminds us of just how much more problematic the right wing of his coalition is also interesting to me.
I would agree with all of that. But that said, I guess two pushbacks. The first is that, again, if you read through the article, it's almost striking the sort of, the repeated meme of the sort of strange new respect from the left that seems to go to Netanyahu as the negotiations move forward. I guess the second thing I would say is that in some ways, I have to think the primary sources for the article were Tzipi Livni and Saeb Erekat. I mean, you just sort of get that sense reading the article. And it doesn't strike me that Livni would have an incentive to paint Netanyahu in as favorable a light as you actually wind up getting in the article. And the third thing is that I will say this, having read the entire article and then reading what you're talking about, which is, I believe, a Times of Israel account of a Netanyahu press conference where he says, no, it's not viable anymore. One gets the sense that he has come to that conclusion now. But I honestly don't think he was of that mind during the negotiations. Maybe that's naive of me, but one gets the sense that this is what he has concluded, particularly after the Hamas-Fatah agreement.
I have to say that makes no sense to me as a genuinely strategic viewpoint. I mean, because Hamas-Fatah, well, I'm stopped because I'm genuinely trying to think of a strategic mindset under which that could be true. Is the point that you supposedly think you could do a two-state solution with Fatah, but you really, even though your own security establishment talks to Hamas, makes deals with Hamas, keeps deals with Hamas all the time, you really believe that you can't do a deal with Hamas? I I think that would be the missing piece for what you're saying to make sense, and that it's a
Fair
little
enough,
too much
but
cognitive dissonance for me.
Okay, but I look at it this way: we are operating in a world now where so many people are being, are being lauded with claims of strategic acumen when in fact it's clearly evidence that they're winging it half the time. It wouldn't shock me if Netanyahu winds up falling into that category as well.
Yeah, you do have to say, whatever you think of Netanyahu, he has extraordinary tactical acumen.
That's undeniably true.
And I think a lot of what he does has to be viewed through that prism.
Right. The sort of second, I'm trying to think. So the second thing that comes through in the piece, although it's only a cameo, is that it might have been a good idea that Susan Rice wound up not being Secretary of State, because the one time Susan Rice appears in the article, it's at the very end as negotiations are starting to fall apart. Erekat and another Palestinian negotiator in the White House, they're growing increasingly pessimistic. They talk to Susan Rice, where Erekat, I think, says something to the effect of, I see, once again, we need to prove to you that we are smarter and more rational than you believe we are. At which point Susan Rice responds, and this is a paraphrase, it's not a direct quote, the problem with you Palestinians is that you can't see the bleeping long picture. So, she might be right about that. I wrote about this.
Isn't that exactly what you and I were just saying about Netanyahu?
No. To be clear, I 90% suspect that if I were in Susan Rice's position, that's exactly what I would think. I'm not sure that's something I would say, though. And that's my point about her being Secretary of State.
Well,
there's a difference between...
So now, we were beating on the Israelis for a while. The history of these kinds of negotiations is that, and look, this is sort of the tactic that you use when you're the side with less power, is you're always looking for something to be offended about.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
And, it's like if Rice hadn't provided it, it would have had to, it was inevitable that somebody was going to provide it as the thing was falling apart, in my view.
Yeah. The third thing, I guess, and this is the most depressing conclusion I've come to, is that I don't know if a two-state solution is possible anymore. That you can argue, there's this sort of tragic quote from Kerry where he basically says at the outset, look, I think we got 18 months to 2 years to be able to... Okay, excuse me, hold on, I'm going to close my window because it really does sound like a cat's being tortured, so hold on 1 second.
So I'm just going to note while you're doing that it's quite extraordinary that a New Republic article has led realist Dan Drezner to question the viability of the two-state solution. I sort of doubt that's what the New Republic had in mind, but...
Okay, so just to be clear, no cats were tortured during the recording of this video, to be clear. Rather, my neighbor is doing construction. Sorry, did I interrupt you?
No, I was just to amuse the viewers. I was saying that what's extraordinary here is that an article published in the New Republic pushes realist Dan Drezner over the edge into doubting the viability of the two-state solution.
Oh, that's fair enough. But this is something, you have more experience in the region than I do. But, the last time I was there, and I have to say that this is a trope that I confess is also a feature very often of trade politics, where there's some round of trade negotiations and you start hearing these things like, we're about to fall over a cliff, or, we're hitting the absolute red line. If we don't do it now, it's never going to happen, and so on and so forth. And then eventually, it does happen. But that said, the most depressing thing about the article was the extent to which that the people that were fans of a two-state solution are all either very, very old or politically marginalized, or becoming marginalized. And so, it might be this case that eventually you can get to a two-state solution, but for that to happen, it's going to require probably significant amounts of bloodshed on both sides for them to realize that a perpetual conflict is not in their interests. And, they've been at war for 2,000 years, so really that perpetual conflict could last for a long period of time.
Okay. Can we just stop on that they've been at war for 2,000 years, because that's actually not true. I call bullshit on that.
No, that's a fair point. Fair enough. But they have been, let's face it though, there's been a fair amount of conflict, at least recently. But I'm going to stop now because I want to hear your optimism about why I'm being overly pessimistic.
Well, you're not going to hear any.
Oh, crap. Okay.
No, I mean, my takeaway, I was last there in April.
Okay.
And my takeaway for a while has been that the status quo is too good for Israelis to do anything risky. And what was on offer was not good enough for Palestinians to do anything risky.
Yeah.
So you were stuck in a place where the status quo for different reasons was preferable to decision-making elites and voters who were picking their decision-making elites on both sides. I don't see, and this to me is the part that is most horrible, is I don't see how the violence that's going on now changes the underlying dynamic.
Right.
Because I don't think it makes Israel offer anything better, and I don't think it makes Palestinians willing to settle for what could be on offer. I also don't think that this kind of conflict shifts the political needle in Israel enough that you could imagine, either a Livni-led coalition or, at least where you got the right wingers out and you got labor in instead. And then we could test, this question that Netanyahu is ready to go. So I'm increasingly unclear how you get to a two-state solution, but I've never been able to see sort of a path that I consider that a path that I would call an optimistic path to a one-state solution. So I would just amend what you said a little bit. And I think we're looking at some period where there will periodically be significant amounts of bloodshed, significant amounts of unrest, significant amounts of suffering, suffering borne much more heavily by the Palestinians, but also borne by Israelis, until the generational shift that you're talking about completes either to the point that you can have a two-state solution or that you have some kind of one-state solution. And I think that one's even farther off and even bloodier before you get there.
Right. I mean, I wrote a blog post last week called "The Very, Very Stable Conflict Equilibrium in Israel-Palestine," which is, I mean, I agree with you. It's not just that the conflict, the current, war is not going to change the dynamic. The current war is part of the stable dynamic, which is every few years Israel decides they have to launch an operation against Hamas to sort of, I think the phrase that's used in some of the articles is mow the grass, meaning, to drain Hamas of rockets and other capabilities, at which point, Hamas will survive in no small part because Israel needs them to survive, because as bad as Hamas is, there are other things that are actually worse in Gaza. Hamas built up its capabilities, and then we repeat the cycle. So, unfortunately, I share your pessimism on this.
Well, so now you've pushed me far enough that I will say a couple of mildly optimistic things. There you go. Okay. Little Miss Sunshine returns. So one, a place to find some optimism and a place to invest energy if one feels the need to do something productive is to look at the sort of civil unrest in recent years in both Israel and in Palestine as another chapter in the Arab Spring, in the protests in Turkey, in Iran, Occupy, if you like, and to look at the characteristics of those movements. And actually, there's a woman whose name I'm now going to butcher at Princeton named Zeynep
Tufekci,
who has written, and she says she thinks Israel and Palestine are different. I think because I'm not in the region, I'm allowed to say I think they're more similar than different. But young people who distrust all formal government structures, who want to, and which makes them less effective political actors and makes those of us who are now sort of on the wrong side of 40 roll our eyes at them, but who also have less time for some of the tropes of conflict that you and I are very baked into, and who are much more interested in, like, let's just fix our society and make it work. So if you want a track for optimism, it is figure out how the energy and willingness to do things other than violence that those folks have. And of course, it would be the over 40 thing to say figure out how it can be channeled. But rather than that is help them figure out how to get a hold of their societies and steer them in other directions.
Wow. Okay, I got to call bullshit on this. I'm sorry. What that reminded me of was, I hope you're right. I will share the hope that you are correct. All I can think of is that interaction that I think this is from Hillary Clinton's memoirs, where she meets with the Egyptians responsible for the Tahrir Square movement in 2011, and sort of talks to them about how, okay, congratulations, you've overthrown Mubarak, now you have to enter politics, and they're like, we don't want to do that. That we'll just let others do that, and of course, you know how this,
we see the result. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So I think my fear is that is probably the sentiment that is shared by many Israelis and Palestinians on
it. It is. There's no question that it is. And again, look, we got to a pretty low level of pessimism, but the interesting question, is, if you look at the various movements of the 60s in both Europe and the U.S., they translated into traditional politics, not maybe as much as people hoped they would at the time, but some pretty big things started to change 10, 15, 20 years later. That's an awful lot of killing left in the Middle East. But now the other sort of interesting point I want to raise here, which I really wonder about, is Europe sort of looked like it was getting close to the end of, in ways that are, I think, diplomatically helpful in terms of Europe's growing willingness to pressure Israel, and quite horrifying in terms of the rise of really nasty anti-Semitism in Europe. And unfortunately, the two things are often twined together in a way that's quite repellent. At the same time, I do wonder whether Europe, which has, significant economic relations with Israel and has choices about how Israel is perceived in the world, there's a great fear. There's a great fear of European boycotts and pressure. And one could imagine a scenario in which Europe plays the bad cop and the U.S. plays the good cop. It's, someone, we try to ask for Twitter input into topics for this. And, we had a question come in this morning about, wasn't this a terrible time for the EU to have lame duck leadership? And to which I have to confess my response was, I hadn't noticed. But it does raise the question of, if you could have some kind of coordinated but not coordinated US-EU response, does the EU in particular have the bandwidth to engage with Middle East policy in that deep a way? And I'm not even sure the EU has bandwidth to engage with Russia at this point.
I was going to say, this is a nice segue into that. I believe this way. The European Union is now just trying to figure out the extent to which they're actually going to sanction Russia in response to the downing of Malaysia Airlines Flight 17. And in some ways, that's I think that has higher priority for them at this point than Israel-Palestine, because that actually involves that involves A, Europe, and B, a lot of their own citizens who died in the plane that was shot down. The interesting thing about that is that in some ways, they agreed last week to meet to decide how many more sanctions they were going to apply against Russia, because Russia was very clearly arming the separatists in Ukraine. But the general expectation was that those sanctions were not going to be as severe as what the United States agreed to in terms of the sanctioning of Rosneft and Gazprom's bank and so forth. That was before the plane was shot down over eastern Ukraine. And, in some ways there are two problems now for Putin in terms of dealing with Europe. The first is that the evidence overwhelmingly points to the fact that the separatists shot down the plane using a weapon system given to them by Russia. You don't say you need, I don't know if the evidence is 100% conclusive, but all of the circumstantial evidence seems to strongly point towards the rebels doing it, and there's almost no circumstantial evidence pointing towards anyone else being potentially culpable. The second thing, though, is that the separatists added insult to injury, not just by the plane getting shot down, but by truly botching the handling of the bodies and the wreckage afterwards, to the point where I think the low point was on Saturday, where it was clear that the person in charge of the crash site, and I'm not making this up, was, I believe, a drunken Ukrainian separatist who went by the nickname Grumpy.
I mean, I would say that the low point was the reports of the looting of duty-free and credit cards from the victims.
Yes.
I mean, which
although those I haven't know if they've been confirmed yet. I mean, I've seen reports of those, but that's a slightly sketchier information as far as I know. But it wouldn't shock me if it happened.
Yeah. I mean, and the interesting thing going forward is going to be that the Netherlands had, within the EU, been one of the less supportive of stronger sanctions. And there's been a real huge firestorm in the Netherlands. People have been referring to this as the Dutch 9/11. Proportionately, this is a bigger percentage of Dutch citizens were killed than Americans on 9/11. So, you know, the level of, it's going to be fascinating to me to see, number one, you know, does that level of public anger translate into either Dutch or EU policy, given that European foreign policy tends to be somewhat more insulated from public pressures. The other thing that I've been wondering about, and you may know more about this from the trade side, but could private citizens launch legal proceedings and basically try to tie up Russian assets and make it impossible or make it much more difficult and risky for Russian money to be in Europe, even absent government sanctions?
Oh, you mean through lawsuits and litigation?
Or is that something you could only do in America?
I gotta say, I doubt. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't. I'm not even sure I wanted to hazard a guess at this, but I would have to say the problem is that it's not obvious to me how you could prove liability by the sort of Russian plutocrats. I mean, it's a attenuated causal chain.
But I think the easier part is connecting major Russian corporate assets to the state.
Yes, but I'm not sure that's correct. But the problem is the extent to which it's an interesting question. I honestly don't know I don't know whether you could actually do that. But you're correct, though, in surmising that, among other things, sort of Russian plutocrats are now officially freaked out because it's not obvious where they can put their money at this point. You know, and my hunch is that they will wind up trying to that they're going to have no choice but to diversify their portfolio to keep some in Russia, some in Europe, and some in the United States. But they're facing a bad situation in all three. So, you know, to that extent, in some ways, the interesting thing going forward is not the actual official sanctions the European Union launches, but rather the extent to which private capital is reacting very negatively to what's happened the past week. And Russia already had a pretty bad first half of the year economically. That said, it's not obvious that any of this. The sanctions can, you know, if the European Union moves forward on sanctions, and I actually think there's now a better than 50-50 chance they will actually not just move forward, but move forward on sanctions that really would actually hurt the Russian economy significantly. It's worth noting the disconnect in terms of the way the world is reacting to this and the way that Russia is reacting to this, which is that the sort of media narrative inside of Russia about the plane shoot down, you know, really it's just sort of a grab bag of conspiracy theories, all of which miraculously managed to absolve Russia from any culpability whatsoever.
I mean, this goes back a little bit to, you know, your rightful scoffing at, you know, social media and young people can change the world. This is an excellent example of, even in this porous media age, how easy it is to using a combination of physically shutting off the space and good propaganda and, you know, dominating your own media environment at home, by the way, how you can really effectively block off information, you know, not that much worse than you could back in the day where you didn't have the internet.
I think in some ways it's even worse than that. The one caveat I will put to that is that while, you know, Putin has demonstrated impressive control over the media environment, in some ways I'm beginning to think that he's going to become the victim of blowback, which is what happens when, you know, you put out this sort of nationalist myth-making exercise that winds up getting so embraced by the public that you're trapped by the rhetoric. I think there are many ways in which Putin would love to actually sort of de-emphasize the conflict in Ukraine and disassociate himself somewhat, at least, from the Ukrainian rebels. The problem is that he's been doing the exact opposite for so long that I think any move in this direction will be seen as a significant climb down. And so it's not obvious to me that he can actually do it.
Yeah, and we may have said this before, but a longer term version of that theory says that it's not the public per se that's the problem, but it's the security establishment. And that you've given the security establishment, both a certain amount of room to run and use their toys and get more toys, and you've given them a status and a place in society with this narrative. And if you walk away from the narrative and you sort of cut off the flow of new things to new expeditions, then you have a security service that's angry. And if you combine with the economy tanking, so you don't have other ways of buying anybody's loyalty, that's where you get really into trouble in the midterm. And as you say, for regional stability and for the fate of other small conflicted territories on Russia's borders, to me that's the really worrisome sort of midterm problem. Is the next time somebody gets angry, well, there's Transnistria, there's other little bits of Georgia, and then there's
the Baltics.
The real scare is the Baltics, where we do have obligations as NATO members to defend them.
No, this is the standard line to make about China the last few years is that I'm not is someone who wants to sound like a wise China watcher says I'm not scared of Chinese strength, I'm scared of Chinese weakness in terms of the economy. I'm increasingly of the attitude now that what scares me actually is what Russia will look like 6 months from now. Because rally around the flag, and sort of nationalist sort of motivations that you're seeing, that can play for a while, but unless it generates really significant gains, eventually it burns out. Particularly compared to a fading economy, and Russia's economy is going to fade if this continues.
Well, it is going to fade whether this continues or not for various reasons. This is going to accelerate the fading. So I don't know if this is more pessimistic or less pessimistic, but I'm not so worried about 6 months. I am worried about 2, 3, 4 years.
Fair enough.
This is a question for you, but the more that prices for oil in particular and other commodities stabilize or go down or do anything but go up sharply, that accelerates Russia's decline economically.
Oh, sure. I mean, that the reason the Russian economy has done well under Vladimir Putin is because of what energy prices have done over the last decade. In some ways, again, this, I hate to say this, but there is a cycle of geopolitical instability that would make some sense, which is from the point of view of an oil exporter, which is you might actually want to goose geopolitical instability in the rest of the world as a way of keeping oil prices high, which thereby sustains your domestic economy. So if you really want to go out there, if this continues in terms of Russia seeming to lose in Ukraine, this gives Russia a greater incentive to make mischief in the Middle East.
That brings us back, I think, to other stories that you and I thought people should be watching that they might have missed.
All right. We should close on that.
I will just mention that the situation in Iraq and Syria has been pushed way down as a result of this, which short term totally understandable, long term given that it ties into everything else we've been talking about. Is worrying to me. And then frankly, I think there are a lot of people in Washington on all sides of the Syria and Iraq debate who are happy not to have attention paid to it, but not to have attention paid doesn't mean it's going away or getting better, or frankly that the choices for the U.S. get any easier.
The story that's under the radar that I suspect it could peak, sometime in the next 10 days is the fact that Argentina is facing a deadline of, I believe, July 30th to comply with a U.S. court arrangement to pay its debt obligations to a group of so-called vulture debt owners that basically refused to agree to Argentina's revised debt arrangements when they defaulted back in 2001. This is one of those things that, like, all of the markets seem to think of as, well, this should be easy for Argentina to agree to. They'll cut some sort of deal, and that will be that. The more I read about this, the less convinced I am that a deal will actually get cut. And I'm kind of curious then whether or not this will have any systemic ripple effect on the global financial markets or not.
Yeah, I was astonished to open up a newspaper site online this morning and have my access to the newspaper site preceded by an ad pleading with me not to allow Argentina to get away without paying what it owes. I was fascinated that the vulture corporations thought that buying internet ads would help. You know, it's not enough you got the Supreme Court, you need internet ads too.
You know, it's about people paying their debts. I mean, you know, that's really what this is all. I can't maintain that. It's not. I mean, this was the feeling I had watching the Germany Argentina World Cup final, which was that it was difficult to root for either of them because from an international political economy perspective, they're both losers as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, you got off some great tweets on that. Or was it, did you tweet or retweet that at some point when the game was scoreless, that if this keeps up, Argentina's going to win by default?
Oh, I must have retweeted that.
Which was pretty awesome. But in all seriousness, I mean, hasn't the global economy sort of priced this in already? I mean, don't you look at this and say, on the one hand, yeah, it's Argentina, they have a certain reputation, and on the other hand, you know, these guys, they could have taken the deal that everybody else got. It was perfectly reasonable. This is kind of a circus, but, you know, Argentina's not that big an economy. Does anybody, I mean, tell me why this would have any ripple effect on anything?
Here's the only thing I will say on this, and I hope I'm wrong, but the thing that's striking to me about the performance of the global economy over the past year is the extent to which it has been, by and large, impervious to all of the geopolitical instability that you've seen. And this is not an insignificant amount of instability. I mean, we're not just talking about the Middle East, which is, you know, seems crazy, and, you know, Russia and Ukraine, which is even more significant. We're also talking about things like the South China Sea and, you know, a brewing, you know, rising tensions between Japan and China. And none of this has really affected the global economy. Now, on the one hand, you can argue markets are actually reacting rationally to all of this. It turns out that most of this actually doesn't have the sort of economic effects that have been predicted. But I do wonder if, in that sense, if Argentina defaults, if that's one of those inflection points that cause markets to suddenly realize, wow, politicians actually are that stupid. And if they're stupid enough on this, maybe they are stupid enough to do things like go to war over the Senkakus or something like that. You know, so in that sense, that's the one thing that gives me pause.
Of course, if what happens here is that the market realizes that politicians are stupid enough to default, the U.S. will be the one that pays for that, presumably, because we won't get the benefit of the doubt the next time we have one of our little chicken matches in Congress.
Maybe, although, again, John Hilsenrath had a great piece in the Wall Street Journal this morning pointing out that, you know, again, one of the effects of all of this geopolitical instability is that the U.S. continues to be able to borrow from anyone we want at a ridiculously cheap basis, despite myriad numbers of predictions over the last 5 years that eventually, you know, people would turn away from the dollar.
Yeah. Well, this is reminding me of a conversation I had with some investment banker types in Turkey while I was there last month, who said, yeah, you know, what's going on with the government here, the decline in regard for Erdogan, the concerns about corruption and instability, none of it matters because there's so much global capital and it needs to go someplace. And so it comes here. And nothing that happens, then their message was, on the one hand, nothing that happens here in the near term is going to change that. And on the other hand, our long-term outlook is sort of negative. So, you know, it's that mix of something somewhere sometime has to change, but none of us can see what it is.
And with that note, I believe my daughter has arrived home from camp, so I need to go do some serious parenting now.
Great. I'm going to close with another viewer input, which was a great question from my buddy Justin Logan at Cato, who asked. He said, you know, and we haven't talked about Asia at all on this podcast, and he said, you know, why isn't there competition? Why don't the Middle East specialists fight with the Asianists for recognition? Why doesn't everybody, you know, fight with the Russia-Ukraine people? And I mean, my answer, I guess, sort of, I felt like I didn't have a really good answer to that one, and I thought it deserved a better and more interesting answer than I came up with. So we'll throw it out there for next time.
I'll offer my tentative answer to that, actually, if you want.
Great.
Before we close, which is, I would say two things. First, that implies there are enough area experts in all of the three places you're talking about for there to be a fight. One of the issues has been the sort of decline in terms of the number of sort of regional experts in terms of these things. But the second thing is that the one thing that all of these groups have in common, and you could argue this has been true the last, week or two, is that they all do want the United States to pay more attention to the rest of the world. So in that sense, there is a cartel of experts that desperately want people to realize, oh, so you thought the rest of the world was unimportant? Yeah, try saying that now. You're right that eventually they should be disputing over like where exactly is more important. And I think I did see some of that, a month or 2 months or 3 months ago. But I think there's enough out there now so that really people are just trying to keep on top of current events.
Yeah, I did sit in on a strategy session recently that was a thinly veiled fight between Middle East and Asia types, but thinly veiled, and no one ever said this. I mean, I guess the other part of the answer that I think we haven't gotten at is this question of who sets the agenda. And I think what we can agree is whoever sets the agenda, it sure as heck is not regional policy experts.
That's very true.
And on that note, hello to your daughter from camp, and Blogging Heads, we'll see you next month.
Take care.